My name is Flo Fu. I'm a musician, director. I love aviation so much. People started to call me Airflow.
Service pilots, and majority of them went down in crashes, but were never given proper military burials. So I'll admit that when Hunter first asked me about presenting today, I questioned if I was really the best person to talk about aviation. I'm not a pilot, and I'm sure most of the other speakers you expect to see at an event like this are your lieutenants, your pilots, people that have done some really cool things and have some really cool photographs. But I am not a pilot. I served one enlistment, I never deployed, and in fact, I actually was stationed at a base without a flight mission. So I was worried to get up here and talk about everything involved in aviation, which does include some pilots, but I was scared I was going to come up here and talk about aviation and not pilots, and you guys would feel ripped off. So apologies in advance, but we're going to be speaking about aviation today. So much to aviation beyond just flying. For the first 30 years of the Women's Air Force, which we will be talking about today, the women were limited to ground crew only. But in modern times, women comprise 20% of the Air Force. When the Women's Air Force was first created in 1948, we were capped to 4,000 members only, 400 officers. But now we make up 20% of the Air Force. But only 6% of those women in the Air Force are pilots. I brought the Navy numbers because the second largest Air Force in the world after the United States Air Force is the US Navy. I know it's a bit of a sore subject, but the Navy was very important in terms of aviation in World War II and in modern times. And the Navy is 16% women and 12% of pilots in the Navy are women. So women in the Navy and the Air Force are both big in terms of aviation. But as of 2021, women only make up about 17% of the total armed forces across all branches. Also, this is my favorite meme. It had to come out today. Although the number of women pilots is growing, it does not mean that thousands of other women involved in aviation are not important. Nor does it mean that the women who served for over 50 years in non-pilot roles were not pioneers in aviation. In World War II, thousands of women in the Army, Navy, Marines, and Coast Guard served in support of aviation missions. They were not pilots. Most of them were not even considered airmen. We also have the Women's Air Force service pilots who were not military members, but they were civilians. And today we are going to talk about aviation big picture and how women in aviation have played a part in shaping the Army, Air Force, Navy, and Marine Corps as we know it today. When I decided that I wanted to talk about aviation and the women involved, my mind started going in about 1,000 different directions. I could talk about the Navy machinists, I could talk about the Army cartographers, I could talk about Marine parachute riggers, and it was starting to get overwhelming. So when I first started writing this, I was thinking, you know what, maybe I should stick with the pilots. It was because the military had finally lifted all combat restrictions for women. It's not a coincidence that I went in the same year that happened. I was able to go in because of it. And these are some of the things that were happening the year that I went into the military. So we have a couple of these headlines about the things that women were achieving in the military. This is within the last 10 years. And since we were talking about somewhat recent events that seem like they should have happened a long time ago, the year after I went in 2016, legislation passed to allow members of the WWII to be interred in Arlington, with the first being laid to rest in September 2016. So we're talking 77 years after these women served their country. The theme for this weekend is remembering the past to honor the future. But the truth is that when we are talking about women's military history, past and present aren't that far apart. World War II was almost 85 years ago. But women weren't allowed into the main Air Force until 1977. Navy women weren't allowed on ships or aircraft with combat missions until 1990. And like I said, the WWII were denied burial until 2016. That doesn't feel like history. And that is why it is so important that every one of you is here today so that we can honor the past. So I appreciate you all coming and listening to me. That way we can honor the past, even if it's the not so distant past. Next slide. So when I was in Air Force basic training, our heritage course, where we supposedly honor the past, was seemingly one-sided. We learned about Hap Arnold, the Doolittle Raiders, the Wright brothers, Stuart Symington, Carl Spaatz, and Grace Chief Master Sergeant Peterson. The next little tiny bio next to her name said she had served in something called the WAF, the Women's Air Force. Has anyone here heard of the Women's Air Force before? Awesome, I'm gonna pick on you later. So when I graduated basic training and finally got base access, the first thing I did was find the library. So when I went to the library on base and looked into Grace Peterson's history more closely, after never having heard of the Women's Air Force, I got on Google, put in Women's Air Force into the search history like you do, and got sneakers. The best part is this is an actual Nike ad or Air Force ad from like the 70s, and it does say, who said women were not meant to fly? So according to Google, and according to what most people would be able to find if they searched Women's Air Force, it's sneakers. That wasn't going to do. And my research into Grace Peterson kicked off a journey that I probably could have never imagined back in 2015. I've always been interested in history. I grew up around here, so you either love history or you move. But it wasn't until I got into the military and started looking into this that I found myself asking, when did military history for women start? So prior to my own enlistment, I had a somewhat basic understanding of women in World War II, but only as Rosie the Riveter and nurses. Growing up in a post-9/11 culture, I knew of women who were deployed and serving, but I hadn't put together the pieces on military women's service begins. And I had also became aware that nobody was really ever speaking about it, and especially in an environment like this. We come to an event like this and we hear about the pilots. So for those of you who have no idea where Grand Forks, North Dakota is, it's in Canada, basically. When I got stationed there, people would ask my folks, where's Mariel stationed at? Canada somewhere, it's just easier. For reference, we're down there. This is the average temperature in the winter, -41. That's my uniform. We used to wake up and the commander would be like, all right guys, marshmallow day. I still have that coat, it's fantastic. But what that meant is that when the sun doesn't come up until about noon and then lasts for an hour and you're snowed in, you get to do a lot of reading. It was that or get into weightlifting, and I don't do that. Not my thing. But it wasn't until I got out of the military and moved to Colorado in January 2018 that I truly grasped how much women's military history is hidden. And I discovered a big piece of that when I transitioned from being active duty to being a veteran myself. I learned that women World War II veterans were discouraged from talking about their war work for a long time because it was socially unacceptable. The women were encouraged to come home, put away the uniform, focus on the future. Your next duty, thanks for all you've done, but thank you. Go get back in the kitchen and help the men adjust to life. They're coming back war veterans. You're not, but they are. So it's your job to put an apron on and help them readjust to civilian life. If they come home and see you in pants, it'll be too much. Get back to normal. That's your next duty. And then in the following years, after decades of women being told their service was something to be ashamed of, I've heard from women veterans of all eras that their service feels like it doesn't count, which is something that I have actually struggled with myself, and this was not something that you understand when you're on active duty. But being in Colorado and adjusting to life outside of the military, as a female veteran who had never deployed, did one term in the military, and was an admin clerk of all things, that's what launched me from researching these women into storytelling. Next slide, please. So I went to University of Colorado. Plot twist, by the way, I'm not an accredited historian. I actually have an architecture degree. But when I went to school at University of Colorado, there is a picture in the library, and that's it in the center there. I learned that the University of Colorado was home to the Navy Language School in World War II. Women who served in the Navy came to Boulder, Colorado to learn about Japanese. Although to be fair, I would not expect the Navy in a landlocked state either. They're actually also in Nevada, which was a surprise. And I learned that Lowry Field, which I unfortunately do not have pictures of, It's now a very expensive condo complex in Aurora, Colorado. It was home to the 2nd Air Force, where women assigned to the Army Air Corps came for technical training in aerial photography and mechanics, jobs that I had no idea women had been allowed to do in the 1940s. In June 2019, I attended my first World War II reenactment in Colorado Springs, in modern clothes just to observe. Bad idea. If you think you're going to get into reenacting, stay away from it. Yeah, it gets you. But when I got there and the Fort Carson museum curator heard that I had an interest in the Women's Army Corps, he went into the archive and came out holding an original WWII officer's winter coat. And it belonged to a WWII stationed at Camp Hale near Leadville, Colorado, which is actually not too far from the modern-day Air Force Academy. He offered it to me and he said, "I will give this to you, but in exchange that I ask that you tell their stories." And that is that uniform there. I do call that the Gateway uniform because it's been downhill from there. So he gave that to me and asked me to tell their stories. So let's talk about their stories. We are talking about military women in aviation, and I think I'm allowed about 45 minutes. So we're going to start in 1941, although women's military roles could be arguably traced back to the Revolutionary War. In May 1941, Massachusetts stateswoman Edith Nurse Rogers put forth a proposal for the creation of a women's army auxiliary. And that word auxiliary is going to be important. That summer, Jacqueline Cochran and Nancy Harkness Love both submitted their own proposals for the Army to develop a non-combat role for women pilots. The British had allowed women to serve alongside the military since 1938, and that was including aviation roles. The British had an organization called Air Transport Auxiliary. They were known as the Atta Girls. But in summer 1941, the war was not our problem, so the American women were all labeled paranoid and their proposals dismissed. And I bet in December 1941, I wish I could have been there when they all got to say, "I told you so." That must have been an awkward conversation. And like I said, we all know what happened December 7th, 1941. There was a female pilot, actually, who had been at Pearl Harbor when it was attacked. And I'm going to be using a lot of newspaper clippings because women's history was not really well photographed and documented, and we can actually trace a lot of their history through the society columns. So what they were doing, where they served, and what they wore, and what kind of lipstick they were wearing was very thoroughly documented in the social columns of the time. So we'll be using quite a few newspaper clippings today to discuss this history. Cornelia Ford had actually been in the air with a student when Japanese Zeros strafed the airfield. She survived Pearl Harbor and became the second woman to serve in the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, but she died in early 1943 in a mid-air collision. The military refused to pay her funeral expenses. And I'm starting with Cornelia because she is a great example of yet another woman in aviation whose history has been lost. And that is one of many histories that we will be discussing today. As referenced earlier, women have been serving in military roles in England since 1938. World War II was happening in so many places all at once. And while, for example, we are all familiar with the D-Day landings on June 6, 1944, many are less familiar with the invasion of Saipan, which occurred on June 15, 1944. So they're happening within a week of each other, an entire globe apart. Simultaneously, the Army Command in the Pacific was planning their invasion to retake the Philippines, which would happen in October of 1944. These manpower logistics were somewhat impossible. The military had to deploy manpower to the Pacific, to Europe, North Africa, Italy, fill assignments at air and in sea, all while maintaining a strong presence in the American theater, where codes are being broken, battle tactics analyzed, supplies are being processed and shipped, radar was being improved, and troops are being trained. It's a lot going on. The military needed bodies, and when that surpassed what the male population alone could manage, they reluctantly called upon the women, because this is what women were expected to do: nurse, knit, and raise money for the war. Also, I love this photo. She's way too happy about her knitting. That's one of the Red Cross patterns. I have no idea what she's knitting, but it looks like fun. So this is what women were originally expected to do during the war. But as these manpower shortages became more prevalent, women stepped up by the thousands. The only problem is, how are they going to serve? In May of 1942, Edith Nurse Rogers' legislation to create the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps passed. This allowed women to serve in the United States Army not as equals, but as auxiliary members. The first women in the WWII were only to serve with the Service of Supply, which thankfully was later named Service Forces. And the women were originally meant to serve in limited roles such as clerical, cooks, bakers, and drivers. Majority of them were assigned to Army air bases. In the first year, over 60,000 women joined the WAAC. The WWII were not subject to Army regulations or the Articles of War. They had no protection. They were also denied overseas pay and could not receive government life insurance. This was great at first, but by December 1942, they were going overseas to Algiers without overseas pay, government life insurance, and were not subject to Army regulations. That became a problem. And at the same time that the WAAC was being established, the Navy was having their own conversations about how to incorporate women. The Navy had learned their lessons from the development of the WWII and brought the women in as members of the Naval Reserve, but that didn't come easily. Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, proposed that women would serve in the Naval Reserve, but the Bureau of the Budget pushed back, saying that the women should model the WWII, where the women were serving adjacent to the Army, but not with benefits and military status. And after much political back and forth, and a little pressure from the president, and probably a reminder of what had happened in 1941 when they didn't listen to women, the bill to bring women into the Navy as equal members of the Naval Reserve passed in July 1942. They did rename. They were not the Navy Sailorettes for long. Next slide, please. So in September of 1942, we get to talk about what people affiliate with aviation in World War II, and that is the WASP program. But the WASP program was not originally called the WASPs. Originally, it was two programs. Nancy Harkness Love, if anyone's flown into Love Field in Dallas, it's named for her husband. I'm going to tell you it was named for her, but realistically it was named for him. But her husband worked for Colonel William Turner, who learned that Nancy Harkness Love was an incredibly talented pilot, and he asked her to oversee a women's aviation program with the intent of ferrying aircraft. Because at this point, they're realizing we're going to need men in combat, and we're not going to send the women to combat, but what can women do to free up other men to go fly in combat? And ferrying aircraft became one of those roles. Nancy Love drafted a plan that went up to General Hap Arnold, who, after being badgered by Eleanor Roosevelt, reluctantly directed Love on September 5th that immediate action be taken. Love started recruiting immediately, and this became the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron, which officially went into operation on September 10th, 1942. It was a civilian operation. They were provided quarters, but they had to pay for it. They paid for their own uniforms, and they were paid $250 a month, which, if it sounds low by modern standards, I promise it was low by 1940 standards too. Women who served in the WAF had to be between the ages of 21 and 35, be a high school graduate, hold a commercial flying license, 200 horsepower engine rating, 500 hours of flight time, and experience in cross-country flights. I'm guessing it won't come as a surprise if I tell you they never got more than 28 recruits. But the amount of work that they were tasked with was outpacing their ability to find qualified recruits. Also, actually, can we go back to that slide? So we're actually here today because of the Women in Aviation Boston chapter. I found this really cool headline. I didn't know this when I first started researching this. Nancy Harkness Love was a Bostonian. She's a local girl. And this is from a newspaper in Kentucky, but they made it very clear she's a Bostonian. So I thought that was interesting that that was what they wanted to highlight, that she was from Boston. I'm not sure if it was a good thing, but. So the solution for finding women qualified to fly came from Jacqueline Cochran, which I'm guessing is a name more of you have heard of than Nancy Harkness Love. Jacqueline Cochran was an accomplished pilot. She broke several records throughout the 1920s and 1930s. In March 1942, at the direction of Hap Arnold, she had gone to England with a group of American female pilots to serve with the Atta Girls. Hap Arnold assured her no decisions regarding women pilots would be made until she returned from England. That lasted about 2 minutes. She was in England still when he had Nancy Harkness Love start her program. So Jacqueline Cochran comes back from England in September of 1942 and learns about Hap Arnold's broken promise. She finally got permission from Arnold to create the Women's Flying Training Detachment, and the first class reported to Houston in October 1942. This provided women with the training they needed for Love's program. By the time they moved to Sweetwater, Texas in December 1942, the now famous Avenger Field, the program was 30 weeks long and the women got 200 hours of flight time. Women had to be between 21 and 35 and have 35 hours of flying time to qualify. Later, that changed to allow women who are as young as 18 or with as little as 15 hours of flight time to join. That's how urgently pilots were needed. But I want to pause for a second here and point out that we learn about Hap Arnold in Air Force basic training. We don't learn about the Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron, the WFD, or any of the women who served in the Army Air Forces after 1943. When I've talked to women veterans of all eras, they tell me they are never taught about women like Nancy Harkness Love, Ovetta Kalpabi, or Mildred McAfee. Jacqueline Cochran has become pretty well known, although it was not for her role in the WASP at first. She was first known for breaking speed records, and in 1953, she broke the sound barrier. It was only in the last couple decades that her work with female pilots has come to light. And admittedly, her name has shadowed Nancy Harkness Love's at times. So my ask for you guys today is that you remember them both. By November of 1942, the same bill that had authorized the Women's Naval Reserve was used to bring women into service in the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard originally called this group Women's Reserve of the Coast Guard. It was shortened to Warthogs. But by December of 1942, the first director, Captain Dorothy Stratton, had wisely recommended renaming the Warthogs to Spars. Supposedly recruiting went up after that. So in November 1942, the Marine Corps announced their intention to bring women into the Marine Corps Reserve. And although the name Femme Marines was tossed around, General Holcomb firmly declared, they are Marines. Officially, they are the USMCWR, try saying that 5 times fast, the United States Marine Corps Women Reserve. But thankfully that was shortened to WR. And while aviation might not be what comes to mind when one thinks of the Marine Corps in World War II, aviation was a key part of the Pacific Theater strategy and heavily involved the Marines. If you look at the poster, that's the most common World War II Marine Corps poster for the women. She's checking out a plane. Aviation was really important as part of the Marine Corps' missions in World War II. The main objective of the island hopping strategy that was used in the Pacific was to gain control of airfields that would allow the United States to bomb targets closer and closer to the Japanese home islands. So this put aviation missions at the heart of the war in the Pacific and at the heart of the Marine Corps' involvement. This meant that back home, women serving in the Marines were serving in dozens of aviation roles to support air power in the Pacific. And one of the most common units the WRs were assigned to was known as AWRS, Aviation Women's Reserve Squadron. There were 20 AWRS across the United States and Hawaii during World War II. And the women were doing everything from mechanics, parachute rigging, loading the planes, maintaining communications. That's going to become obvious today that women were really doing everything. So by the end of 1942, thousands of women had entered the military or taken on roles that served to support the military. And the one role that connected all of them was aviation. Regardless of the organization or branch of service, aviation is the thread which ties women's service together during World War II. Despite this, it is the role the women are least known for. And in the case of the WASP, it was one of the most dangerous roles and one without military benefits. And these are some examples of aviation roles in World War II. I try to bring a couple that represent all the different, but thankfully there's quite a few that it was hard to choose from. But we have WAC, we've got Navy, we've got Army represented here. As we get into 1943 and talk more about where and how these women served in aviation, I wanted to take a moment to emphasize that these women were doing the majority of the aviation work in World War II. And with the exception of the WASP, none of them could fly. They pack parachutes, manage supply and load of aircraft, cartographers, weathermen, air traffic controllers, mechanics, and so much more. All things that any pilot depends on for a safe and successful mission. And who gets credit for a successful mission? The male pilots. None of the women back home. In January of 1943, Edith Norris Rogers decided the women that were getting stationed overseas and women in the Army deserved the military benefits for the service they had done. She put forth new legislation to change the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps to the Women's Army Corps, giving women full benefits and status as members of the Army. The women's job opportunities expanded to allow women to serve in the ground forces, the service forces, and most important for today's lecture, the Army Air Force. By the end of World War II, 40% of women soldiers were serving with the Army Air Forces. And the women who served with the AAF were known as the AirWACs. Their roles were weather forecasters and observers, electrical specialists, sheet metal workers, training instructors on various systems including the flight simulator, control tower specialists, airplane mechanics, photo laboratory technicians, and photo interpreters. And notably, 7,000 AirWACs served overseas in all theaters of the war, and 3 WACs received the Air Medal for their service. Who here has seen Masters of the Air? All right, well, let me tell you something you probably didn't know about that show. What's missing from it is the involvement of the Women's Army Corps in the 8th Air Force. By September 1944, over 2,000 WACs were serving with the 8th Air Force in England. I think I missed that episode because I didn't see them anywhere. And another woman who is connected to Masters of the Air is actually this wasp over here at the end. That's Josephine Pitts Egan. She was married to Colonel John Egan, who was featured in Masters of the Air. I kind of missed the part that he was married to a wasp. And this is a 1944 recruiting booklet. So by the middle to the late end of the war, they were specifically recruiting women for air roles. They were not going to be pilots, but they made it very clear that aviation was a big need in World War II. And while the AirWACs and the WASP are the most direct connection to the modern day Air Force, the Navy has its own rich history in aviation. So while the AirWACs were expanding their roles into aviation, the Navy had incorporated women in aviation from their beginning. Over 23,000 women in the Navy would hold aviation roles during World War II. And they served as aviation machinist mates, parachute riggers, photographers, metalsmiths, aerographers mates, gunnery instructors, radio men, control tower operators. They trained pigeons, and they taught aerial navigations and operated flight simulators. So they did everything but fly the plane. And they're not remembered for this at all. And actually, following legislation that allowed the WAVs and the WRs to serve in the Pacific Theater, they were limited to Alaska and Hawaii, but 80 WAVs were stationed in those territories as air navigation officers on naval air transport flights. Does anyone here know that the Japanese actually invaded Alaska during World War II? It was the only land-based invasion the Japanese made of the United States. They landed in the Aleutian Islands. A common misconception is that the women were never in real danger, but that's a myth. Women may have not served in combat roles, but they served in some pretty dangerous places, and they showed just as much zeal and bravery in the dangerous jobs they took up without hesitation. I have a lot of pictures because it was considered a top secret mission, but a good example of the dangers of the American theater that took place not far from here. Women in the Navy WAVs served on Cape Cod, where there was credible risks of U-boat traffic and German aircraft. The WAVs are responsible for maintaining radar and monitoring radio traffic. And a U-boat was actually sunk off the coast of Block Island in Rhode Island, so this was not simply busy work, it was a serious task. Another important mission taking place on Cape Cod was Long-Range Navigation Station Chatham. It was part of the Atlantic Chain, and Lawrence stands for, the Lawrence Chain is a series of land-based transmitting stations. These are all hundreds of miles apart, and they transmit critical information for navigation of ships and aircraft. What's unique about the Long-Range Navigation Monitor Station Chatham, I practiced that, I'm still stumbling. They could have given that a better name. But what's interesting about this one here on the Cape, it was run entirely by women in the Coast Guard. This was the first and only long-range navigation station to be operated entirely by women. The navigation of safe aircraft from the East Coast, most of those flights were going to England, it was completely dependent on women. They didn't teach us that. And I am aware that the Coast Guard is probably the last thing that you guys expect when you go to an aviation lecture, but the spars, the Coast Guard spars, are such a critical part of maintaining the overall systems that kept aviation missions operating smoothly. This is just the very basics of women's aviation history in World War II, just World War II. It is hard to fathom that in a period of 6 years, the women stepped up into roles in which they had previously been banned. They took on roles for which they were underpaid, underappreciated, attacked, and slandered. And yet they excelled. Despite all this, no matter the role, they excelled. The reason I have focused so much time on World War II today is to emphasize the importance of recognizing aviation as a whole. That when we limit ourselves to only talking about pilots, we lose sight of this tremendous achievement. The military did too. They completely minimized the women's impact and threw all of their efforts out the window. In 1944, the WASP program was fully shut down. The women who had served in the Army, Navy, Coast Guard, and Marines were facing complete demobilization in 1946. Their contracts had been for the duration of the war plus 6 months. As we move into the post-war years, I want you to remember the impact these women had in World War II because it gets lost for the next 25 years. The military women were able to transition into a permanent role in the armed forces due to the passage of the Integrated Service Act in June 1948. However, they were still limited in what they could do. I said at the beginning they were capped to a very small percentage. But the women had beat the original milestone of the end of the war plus 6 months, but barely. The men were opposed to the Integrated Service Act, and they wanted women to remain in the reserves at best. The most common theory I've seen for why this bill was allowed to pass is that we moved out of World War II and promptly started right into the Cold War era. There's a very short window between those, and the consensus was that the women might serve in a peacetime capacity, but nobody was really sure for how long. And sure enough, women went on to serve in Korea in the early 1950s and then into Vietnam. Several of them were in country, and they were in limited but official military roles. Now, to talk about the end of the WASP program takes far more than I could go into in one speech alone, but a big piece of what I do with my group, with 350 Girls, is to change how we talk about this history. And in my research, I found an article from the National Museum of the United States Army that claimed the WASP were undone by ambition. I have to bring a screenshot because nobody believes me, but this is the contemporary stance, is that the WASP were undone by their own ambition. And while it is true that the WASP had opportunities to join the military in 1943, it was as members of the WWII. Jacqueline Cochran refused to accept this, wanting the WASP to remain their own program. And why shouldn't they? The WASP remained civilians throughout the war. In early 1944, legislation HR 4219 proposed incorporating the WASP into the Army Air Corps, but it failed by 19 votes. The key argument against it: the war was wrapping up in Europe. Male pilots are coming home. Don't take their jobs. So the WASP were completely closed down in 1944. And I love that the National Museum of the United States Army chose to blame the women for the end of their program. Undone by ambition, as if wanting veteran status, benefits for the dangerous work they did, is an unreasonable expectation after their service to this country. But that is a contemporary example of how women's military service is still seen. Military service is something that men get drafted for, but women are overly ambitious for wanting to participate as equals. Since we are talking about being drafted for military service, none of the WASP or any of the women who served in World War II or after have ever been drafted. We ladies have always been a volunteer force. They didn't teach us that part in basic training either. Was going through this process of being disbanded because of their own ambition. The women were fighting for a permanent role in the military, But the Army and the Army Air Corps were going through a bit of a nasty divorce, and then one of the things they were fighting over is who's getting custody of those women. And according to a newspaper article from September 1947, the WACs, from all groups, including the Air WACs, were going to stay with the Army until custody arrangements could be made for them to join the Air Force. That's why I bring the newspapers. The language of this time is hard to believe unless you see it yourself. And instead of arrangements being made for women to join the Air Force, a separate program called the Women's Air Force was created in 1948. The women could only serve in ground roles, and this would last until 1977 when the WAF, not the WAFS from earlier, but the WAF for the Women's Air Force, was integrated with the main Air Force. And this next paragraph gets a little complex, so just bear with me for a sec as we muddle through this. Because the Air Force was separated from the Air Force Reserve and the Women's Air Force, many history books, including the ones I was handed in the Air Force, claim that the WASP and the WAC never transferred into the Air Force. That part is true. What is less known is that they did transfer into new roles in the Air Force Reserve and the Women's Air Force. When the Air Force formed in 1948, they created the Air Force Reserve, which included women. Nancy Love Harkness and Jacqueline Cochran both transferred to the Air Force Reserve. But like their wartime equivalency, the women pilots in the Air Force Reserve were considered federal civilian employees. Officially, none of the Air WACs made the transition into the Air Force in 1948, although approximately 2,000 enlisted women and 100 officers stayed in Army Air Force units. So while it is true, none of these women went into the Air Force, it does not mean that their service to this country was over. That is a big misconception, and that is how we are taught, but it is not true. So if the Air Force was looking for some names to include in our training manuals and heritage course, I'm going to recommend we start with Staff Sergeant Esther Blake. She was the first woman to join the Women's Air Force in 1948. She is a World War II veteran who enlisted in the WAC in 1944. We could learn about Geraldine Pratt May, who was a WAC officer in World War II and went on to serve as the first director of the Women's Air Force. Both illustrate that the Air WACs did in fact continue to serve after World War II in new roles. Both should be included in the Air Force Heritage module. I also want to mention Major General Jean Holm. She was, according to the history books, the first woman to become a 1-star general in the Air Force and a 2-star general in any service branch. But what's interesting to me is that she's identified as being the first 1-star general in the Air Force. She retired before the services integrated, so she was technically the first 1-star in the Women's Air Force. So the Air Force didn't want her to serve, but they wanted credit for her being the first 1-star. So women were in the Air Force when it's convenient for the history books, but at the same time, they were breaking grounds within their own segregated unit. So one of the things that made me so motivated to talk about women's history in aviation was the opportunity to set the record straight on their service. In my research on the service of women in aviation, I found something I was not looking for at the onset. It taught me so much about what it means to be a veteran. When we study World War II roles, there's so much emphasis on every single role counting. Every job is one step towards victory. Every man you free up to go fight, one step closer to winning and bringing them home. But now, in modern times, when we classify roles as better than others, we also rank our veterans by default. And that impact is significant as fewer veterans feel comfortable coming forward with their stories. And this perpetuates a cycle of missing and hidden stories, which is why this speech is dedicated to the enlisted, someone who is not the first of something, and people who feel their service doesn't count. I encourage you to come forward with your stories. I promise, I have not forgotten about the Navy or the Marines, although it's kind of easy to do. So while the Navy and Marines never had female pilots during the war, keeping the women in ground-based aviation roles post-war was less of an insult. But the impact that the wartime service had on women after the war is tangible. As the women in the Navy will continue to refer to themselves as the Navy Waves well into the 1970s, despite being integrated post-war. I actually just found a license plate at Brimfield that was from the Navy service. They had their reunion. It's from 1992, and it said, like 50 years on, still special. So these women, even if they never shared it publicly, carried pride in their service throughout the rest of their lives. The WACs also maintained their name even after the WAC program was merged in the Army in the 1970s. There was so much pride in being a WAVE, a WAC, a Woman Marine, or a SPAR. Much changed for military women in the 1970s, and if you look at my Air Force textbook, officially this is where they like to start because it's a little bit more comfortable. The Women's Air Force was disbanded in 1977, and women were allowed to join the Air Force as full-fledged airmen, as I would do in 2015. In 1973, the Navy introduced its first flight program for women, and the Air Force followed in 1976. And I'm thinking the Air Force doesn't like us reminding them that the Navy was first, but the truth is that these first women who flew for the Air Force and the Navy were not really the first. They were building on a legacy of some incredible women who had come before them. But their service matters too. In 1977, around the time that flight programs are being introduced for the Navy and the Air Force, the WAFs finally earned their hard-earned veteran benefits. So I guess they weren't overly ambitious after all. I know I just threw a lot at you, but I hope that the common thread of women's continuous service and contributions to military aviation since 1942 has been clear. Over 80 years of service, countless remarkable women broke dozens of barriers that allowed this young woman from Concord, Massachusetts to enlist and serve her country in 2015. As of today, roughly 1.5 million women serve across the U.S. military branches, the Guard and the Reserve. They serve in every role from administrative, infantry, motor transport, logistics, nuclear security, and the most important, that based on today's speech, aviation. All the women who dared to challenge social norms and break glass ceiling after glass ceiling, those are the names who are never mentioned within the ranks of those who carry on their legacy. In 2015, when I graduated as an airman first class and started looking for my heritage, I never imagined the journey it would take me on, or the women whose uniform I was proud to carry on. I have a couple of minutes now actually for questions, because like I said, I know I threw a lot at you. But, oh yeah, rotten produce, I've had a few.
Kristen here is a woman.
I think it was an amazing book because it changed their perspective on what military service looks like. But it was interesting because I had the privilege of being at the Women's Memorial last year for Veterans Day, and I actually got to meet several of the Vietnam nurses, but I also met a lot of other women that were in Vietnam. So I'm actually going to share their perspective because it actually helped motivate me, because the nurses in Vietnam are one of the more common stories. And while it's amazing that a book like hers is coming to light, it's also bringing other women out of the woodwork and saying, hey, I wasn't a nurse, but I was there. So her book does double duty in bringing the stories to so many women who were there.
We thought she was going to college, and she did a 180 and decided to go military. She's our only girl. You know, we were a little bit disappointed, tried to talk her out of it, but fast forward 4 years later, we couldn't have been prouder of the time that she served. And it wasn't easy, and we don't feel like she was always appreciated for her service by her fellow soldiers as well. And but she made it, and she graduated with, with honors, so to speak, honorable discharge. So thank you so much for now doing what you're doing, and just letting us all know we need to appreciate our female vets too.
Actually, I'm going to say thank you. I've got my parents and my grandmother here. And speaking of people being shocked, I called my dad first because I was terrified to tell my mom I joined the Air Force. And he laughed and said, I'm not telling her. You can tell your mom. I think I was more scared of that than going into basic training. But I don't come from a military family. I had some family in World War II working, and actually my great-grandfather was an electrician on a Liberty ship. But when I joined the military, my family was just like, what? We don't do that. So, but I do want to comment on something else you said about a lot of people feel uncomfortable when people say thank you for your service. And something that I advise veterans to do is, if you're uncomfortable with that, say either thank you for your support, or say because you're taking the acknowledgement for all the veterans who came before us. So when we are being thanked for our service, we are also representing all the veterans who came before. So when someone says thank you for your service, I always tell people you can say thank you for your support, or thank you for the support in the military, or this is an honor of the veterans who came before me. So no veteran stands alone. We are on the shoulders of everyone who served before us. So.